What if I told you that everything we think we know about human civilization could be completely wrong? What if the story we've been taught about our ancestors, about the rise of cities and writing and complex society, is missing an entire chapter that stretches back not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of years into the past? Right now, as you're watching this video, beneath your feet and under the oceans that cover most of our planet, there might be traces of civilization so ancient that they make the pyramids look like yesterday's construction project. We're talking about societies that could have risen and fallen when our species was supposedly nothing more than scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, scraping by in a world we barely understood. But here's where it gets interesting. What if that entire narrative is built on a foundation that's starting to crack? What if the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but simply evidence of time's incredible power to erase? Today, we're going to dive deep into one of the most controversial questions in archaeology and anthropology. Could advanced civilizations have existed 100,000 years ago, long before anything we recognize as organized society? And if they did exist, what would that discovery do to everything we think we know about human history? This isn't just some wild speculation or fantasy. This is about real archaeological anomalies, genetic mysteries, and scientific discoveries that don't quite fit the timeline we've all learned in school. By the end of this series, you'll understand why some researchers are quietly asking whether we've been looking at human history completely backwards. Let me start with a number that should blow your mind. 100,000 years. Try to really grasp what that means. If you took every single year of recorded human history, from the earliest writing systems in Mesopotamia all the way to right now, and then multiplied that entire span by 20, you'd finally reach 100,000 years. That's not just ancient. That's almost incomprehensibly deep time. And here's what makes this number so significant. Modern humans, people who looked exactly like us and had brains identical to ours, have been walking this planet for at least 200,000 years. That means for half of our species' existence, we supposedly accomplished almost nothing that would qualify as civilization. No cities, no monuments, no organized societies, just small groups wandering around with stone tools. Does that seem right to you? Does it make sense that beings with our intelligence and creativity would spend 100,000 years doing essentially the same things, generation after generation, without any major breakthroughs or innovations? The standard story goes like this. For the vast majority of human existence, we lived as hunter-gatherers in small mobile groups. Then, around 10,000 years ago, something magical happened. We figured out agriculture. Suddenly, we could settle down, build permanent communities, and everything we recognize as civilization exploded into existence within just a few thousand years. It's a neat story. It's clean and simple and easy to understand. But what if it's wrong? What if the real story is that human civilization has risen and fallen multiple times across our species' history? What if there have been cycles of complexity and collapse that stretch back far beyond anything we've discovered? What if the civilizations we know about are just the most recent attempts, the ones that happened to leave behind traces that could survive until modern archaeology came along to find them? Think about this for a moment. When archaeologists study the past, they're working with fragments. A piece of pottery here, some stone tools there, maybe the foundation of a building if they're really lucky. But here's the problem with fragments. They can only tell us about the things that were built to last, or that got incredibly lucky and survived in exactly the right conditions. Wood rots, textiles decay, metals corrode, even stone, given enough time and the right conditions, can crumble into dust. A city built from organic materials could vanish completely in just a few centuries. Now imagine what 100,000 years could do to erase evidence of human achievement. But it gets worse. The deeper you go back in time, the fewer archaeological sites exist. For the past few thousand years, we can map human settlements across entire continents. Go back 10,000 years, and we're dealing with scattered villages. But go back 100,000 years, and we're working with maybe a handful of sites across the entire planet, most of them incomplete and heavily eroded. This creates what I call the preservation paradox. The absence of evidence from deep prehistory might not mean our ancestors lived simple lives. It might just mean that time has been incredibly effective at erasing the evidence of whatever they actually accomplished. And here's where things get really interesting. We're starting to find cracks in the traditional timeline. Discoveries that don't quite fit the story we've been telling ourselves about human development. Take stone tools, for example. In the last few decades, archaeologists have uncovered blades and points from sites that are supposed to be way too old for such sophisticated craftsmanship. We're talking about tools that show standardization, symmetry, and techniques that suggest not just skill, but organized knowledge passed down through generations. Some of these artifacts are being dated to periods when humans were supposedly barely capable of making crude stone flakes. Or consider symbolic behavior. We've found shell beads in Africa and the Middle East that are over 75,000 years old. Pieces of ochre with deliberate engravings. Stone fragments with markings that might represent abstract thought or even early symbolic systems. This isn't the behavior of simple survival-focused groups. This is evidence of culture, of meaning-making, of societies complex enough to create objects that served no practical survival purpose. Then there are the migration patterns that keep pushing our timelines further and further back. For decades, scientists believed humans first left Africa around 6,000 years ago. But new discoveries keep appearing that suggest human presence in Asia, Australia, and even the Americas much earlier than anyone expected. Australia is particularly interesting because it was never connected to any other landmass, even during the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age. To reach Australia 65,000 years ago, humans had to cross multiple stretches of open ocean. That's not accidental. That requires watercraft, navigation skills, and the kind of planning and cooperation that we usually associate with much more recent civilizations. What does it mean that humans were capable of ocean voyaging tens of thousands of years before we thought they could organize anything more complex? than hunting parties? And speaking of the ocean, here's something that should keep you up at night. More than 70% of Earth's surface is covered by water, and the vast majority of it has never been explored. During the ice ages, when sea levels were much lower, vast areas of land that are now underwater were exposed and available for human settlement. If you were an early human looking for the best place to build a community, where would you go? You'd head for the coastlines, where food was abundant, travel was easier, and resources were plentiful. But here's the problem. Those ancient coastlines are now hundreds of feet underwater, covered by sediment that's been accumulating for tens of thousands of years. Any evidence of coastal civilizations from 100,000 years ago wouldn't just be hidden. It would be buried under layers of mud and debris at the bottom of the ocean in places we've never even thought to look. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of this whole question. We're starting to find anomalies underwater, structures that some researchers believe show signs of human construction, dating back far longer than our accepted timeline allows. Off the coast of Japan, there's the site called Yonaguni that features what appear to be massive stone terraces, steps, and geometric shapes. Some argue these are natural geological formations. Others insist the features are too precise, too ordered to be anything but artificial. The debate continues, but the very existence of such formations raises questions about what else might be hidden beneath the waves. Similar underwater anomalies have been reported off the coasts of India, in the Mediterranean, and in Southeast Asia. In each case, the challenge is interpretation. How do you distinguish between natural geology and ancient construction when you're working hundreds of feet underwater with limited visibility and equipment? But here's what makes this particularly fascinating. These aren't isolated cases. Reports of underwater structures that don't fit natural patterns keep appearing from different parts of the world. Even if most of them turn out to be natural formations, what if even one of them represents something our timeline can't account for? The implications would be staggering. It would mean that human history is far more complex than we've assumed. It would suggest that the story of civilization isn't a straight line from simple to complex, but a series of rises and falls that stretch back far deeper into the past than we've been willing to consider. This is just the beginning of what we're going to explore in this series. We're going to look at genetic evidence that suggests human populations were far more complex and interconnected in the distant past than the archaeological record shows. We're going to examine artifacts that seem to be out of place in time and consider whether our methods of dating and interpretation might be missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. We're going to dive into the myths and oral traditions that cultures around the world have preserved for thousands of years. Stories of great floods, lost cities, and vanished civilizations that might contain kernels of real historical memory. And we're going to grapple with the fundamental question of what we mean when we use the word civilization at all. Does it require writing and monumental architecture? Or could there have been forms of human organization and achievement that we wouldn't recognize because they don't match our expectations? The journey we're about to take will challenge everything you think you know about human history. It will make you question the assumptions we've built our understanding of the past on, and consider possibilities that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to explore. Because here's the thing, if we're wrong about this, if there really were advanced civilizations 100,000 years ago, then the story of humanity is far older, far more complex, and far more remarkable than we've ever imagined. But before we dive deeper into the evidence, we need to understand just how stacked the deck is against finding proof of ancient civilizations. The challenges aren't just significant, they're almost insurmountable. And that's exactly what makes the few anomalies we do find so compelling. Let's talk about the enemy that's been working against us for 100,000 years. Time itself. Time is the great eraser, the ultimate destroyer of human achievement. It doesn't care how magnificent your civilization was, how advanced your technology, or how proud your monuments. Given enough time, it will reduce everything to dust and scatter that dust to the wind. Consider what happens to our modern world if we just disappeared tomorrow. Within decades, wooden structures would rot and collapse, steel would rust and crumble, concrete would crack and be overtaken by vegetation. Even our greatest achievements, our skyscrapers and highways and dams, would be gone within centuries. And that's with materials specifically engineered for durability. Now imagine a civilization from 100,000 years ago, built with whatever materials were available then. Even if they had developed impressive construction techniques, even if they built on a massive scale, what would be left after so much time? The honest answer is almost nothing. Maybe some scattered stone blocks that could easily be mistaken for natural formations. Perhaps some metal artifacts buried so deep and corroded so badly that we'd never recognize them as artificial. Possibly some genetic traces in isolated populations or fragments of memory preserved in oral traditions that have been transformed beyond recognition. This is why the search for ancient civilizations is like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle when 99% of the pieces have been lost, and half of the remaining pieces might not even belong to the puzzle you think you're working on. But there's another layer to this problem that makes it even more complex. It's not just that evidence gets destroyed over time. It's that the kind of evidence we're trained to look for might not be the right kind at all. When archaeologists search for signs of civilization, they look for specific markers: written language, monumental architecture, metalworking, pottery, urban centers with clear signs of planning and organization. These are the signatures of the civilizations we know about, so we assume they're the signatures of all civilizations. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if there were forms of human organization and achievement that operated completely differently from anything in our historical experience? What if there were civilizations that built primarily with organic materials that have long since decayed? What if there were societies that chose not to create permanent monuments, but instead focused on knowledge, art, or spiritual achievements that leave no archaeological trace? What if there were cultures that developed sophisticated technologies we wouldn't recognize because they followed completely different principles from our own? This isn't wild speculation. Even in the historical period, We know of highly advanced societies that left surprisingly little archaeological evidence. The Indus Valley civilization supported large cities with sophisticated drainage systems and standardized weights and measures. But their script remains undeciphered, and much of their material culture has vanished. If we can lose so much knowledge about a civilization that existed just 4,000 years ago, in a region that's been continuously inhabited and studied, what might we have lost from periods 10 or 20 times more distant? The more you think about these limitations, the more you realize that absence of evidence really isn't evidence of absence. It's just evidence that we're working with an incredibly incomplete record, trying to reconstruct a vast and complex story from a handful of fragments that happen to survive against impossible odds. And this brings us to something that should fundamentally change how we think about human potential in the deep past. The fragments we do have, the few pieces of evidence that managed to survive 100,000 years of erosion, decay, and geological chaos, consistently show that early humans were far more capable than our traditional timeline suggests. Every time we find evidence of symbolic thinking, artistic expression, or technological sophistication from periods that are supposed to be too early for such developments, it forces us to push our estimates of human capability further back in time. But here's the crucial point. These discoveries probably represent just the tiniest fraction of what actually existed. If we're finding shell beads and engraved ochre from 75,000 years ago, what does that tell us about the full range of cultural expression that existed then? If we're finding sophisticated stone tools from periods when humans were supposedly barely capable of basic tool making, what does that suggest about the technologies they might have developed that we'll never find evidence for? If humans were capable of ocean voyaging 65,000 years ago, navigating by stars and currents to reach Australia, what other achievements in exploration, trade, and cultural exchange might they have accomplished that have been completely erased by time? The pattern is consistent and striking. Every major breakthrough in our understanding of deep human history reveals greater complexity, earlier innovation, and more sophisticated behavior than we previously thought possible. The trend isn't toward simpler explanations. It's toward recognizing that our ancestors were far more capable than we've given them credit for. This creates a fascinating paradox in how we interpret the evidence. When we find something that fits our expectations about the past, we accept it without much question. But when we find something that challenges those expectations, something that suggests earlier or more advanced development than our timeline allows, we become incredibly skeptical. That skepticism isn't necessarily wrong. Extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence, and the history of archaeology is littered with mistakes, misinterpretations, and outright hoaxes. But the pattern of resistance to evidence that doesn't fit established models is worth examining. Consider how long it took for the scientific community to accept that humans reached the Americas earlier than the Clovis culture. For decades, Any evidence suggesting earlier human presence was dismissed, explained away, or simply ignored. Sites that clearly showed human occupation thousands of years before the accepted timeline were rejected by mainstream archaeology until the evidence became so overwhelming that the old model had to be abandoned. The same thing happened with evidence of interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals. For years, the idea was considered impossible despite mounting genetic evidence. It wasn't until DNA analysis became so sophisticated that the results couldn't be ignored that the scientific consensus finally shifted. These cases show us something important about how knowledge advances in archaeology and anthropology. It's not just about finding evidence. It's about accumulating enough evidence that challenges the existing framework to force a paradigm shift. And that process can take decades, even when the evidence is relatively clear and recent. Now imagine trying to establish evidence for civilizations that existed 100,000 years ago. The evidence would be fragmentary, ambiguous, and open to multiple interpretations. The timeline being challenged isn't off by a few thousand years, but by tens of thousands. The implications aren't just about adjusting our understanding of human migration or technological development, but about fundamentally rethinking the entire trajectory of human civilization. Under these circumstances, it's not surprising that mainstream archaeology approaches such claims with extreme caution. The burden of proof is enormous, and the evidence, almost by definition, is going to be insufficient to meet that burden definitively. But that doesn't mean the question isn't worth asking. In fact, it might be one of the most important questions we can ask about our species' history. Because if we're wrong about this, if there really were complex civilizations in the deep past, then everything we think we know about human development, about the relationship between technology and society, about the trajectory of progress itself, needs to be reconsidered. The implications extend far beyond archaeology. If human civilization is much older than we think, if it has risen and fallen multiple times across our species' history, then our entire understanding of sustainability, social organization, and long-term cultural survival becomes a different conversation entirely. We're not just talking about rewriting history textbooks. We're talking about fundamentally changing how we see ourselves as a species, how we understand our capabilities and our limitations, and how we think about our future on this planet. This is why the search for evidence of ancient civilizations matters so much, even when that evidence is fragmentary and controversial. It's not just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about understanding what humans are capable of, what we've achieved before, and what we might achieve again. The story we're uncovering isn't just about lost civilizations. It's about lost possibilities, forgotten experiments in human organization and achievement that might hold keys to challenges we're facing today. As we continue this exploration, we're going to examine the specific pieces of evidence that suggest our timeline might be incomplete. We're going to look at genetic mysteries that hint at complex population structures in the deep past. We're going to consider artifacts and structures that don't fit our accepted chronology. and we're going to explore the myths and legends that cultures around the world have preserved, stories that might contain memories of real historical events. But most importantly, we're going to approach this investigation with both open minds and critical thinking. Because the truth about human civilization, whatever it turns out to be, is far too important to be distorted by either blind skepticism or wishful thinking. The journey into deep time is just beginning, and the discoveries waiting for us there might change everything we thought we knew about who we are and where we came from. The evidence starts to get really interesting when we look at what's hiding in our own DNA. While archaeologists dig through fragments of stone and bone, geneticists have been uncovering a completely different kind of historical record, one that's written in the genetic code of every person alive today. And what they're finding doesn't match the simple story we've been told about human development. Not even close. Here's something that should make you pause. When scientists first started analyzing human DNA, they expected to find evidence of a single lineage spreading out from Africa in neat, orderly waves. What they actually found was far more complex. Our genetic history is full of mixing, interbreeding, and interactions between different groups of humans, some of whom were quite different from us. We now know that as our ancestors spread across the world, they encountered other human species, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in parts of Asia, and probably other groups we haven't even identified yet. These weren't brief, hostile encounters. These were sustained interactions that included interbreeding and cultural exchange. Most people today carry genetic material from these ancient encounters. If you're of European or Asian descent, you probably have Neanderthal DNA in your cells right now. If your ancestors came from certain parts of Asia or Oceania, you likely carry Denisovan genes as well. But here's where it gets really mysterious. Geneticists have identified what they call ghost lineages. These are fragments of DNA that clearly come from human groups that have never been found in the fossil record. Entire populations have left no bones, no artifacts, no archaeological trace where entire civilizations of humans, that means. They're physical record, but people who lived, thrived, and contributed to our genetic heritage, but who completely, that we only know whatsoever. Think about who have been completely erased from the on in our DNA. If they existed because of genetic analysis, what does whole populations can vanish, so that tell us about how much of human history has been lost? The genetic evidence also reveals something else that's fascinating. Human populations in the deep past weren't isolated groups slowly spreading across empty continents. They were dynamic, interconnected networks with complex patterns of separation and reconnection that stretched across vast distances. Some studies suggest that groups of humans were separated for long periods, developing independently, and then later came back into contact and mixed again. Over the span of 100,000 years, this could have happened multiple times, allowing different populations to experiment with different forms of social organization, technology, and culture. This genetic mixing wasn't just about biology. When populations come together, they also exchange ideas, technologies, and knowledge. If these cycles of separation and reconnection were happening throughout human history, It means that innovations developed by one group could have spread far more widely than the archaeological record suggests. Imagine a coastal civilization that developed sophisticated navigation techniques 100,000 years ago. Even if their settlements were later submerged by rising seas, their knowledge could have been carried by traders and explorers to other regions, influencing the development of societies thousands of miles away. We might be seeing echoes of these lost connections in the similarities between cultures that supposedly developed independently. The prevalence of flood myths around the world, for instance, might not just be about shared experiences of natural disasters. It might reflect actual historical memories of civilizations that were destroyed when the sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The genetic evidence also suggests that human migration patterns were far more complex than we once thought. People weren't just moving in one direction, slowly spreading from Africa to populate empty continents. They were moving back and forth, establishing trade networks, sharing technologies, and maintaining connections across vast distances. This kind of long-distance interaction requires organization, planning, and social structures sophisticated enough to coordinate complex activities across multiple generations. It's not the behavior of simple hunter-gatherer bands. It's the behavior of societies with the capacity for long-term thinking and large-scale coordination. But perhaps the most intriguing genetic mystery involves what we don't find in the DNA record. If there were large, complex civilizations in the deep past, we might expect to see genetic signatures of population bottlenecks, periods when human numbers crashed due to disasters or conflicts. Some geneticists argue that they do see evidence of such bottlenecks, periods when human populations dropped dramatically before recovering. These events could represent natural disasters that wiped out major population centers, wars between competing civilizations, or environmental changes that made certain regions uninhabitable. The timing of some of these genetic bottlenecks is particularly interesting. They seem to cluster around periods when we know major environmental changes were occurring, times when sea levels were rising or falling, when climate zones were shifting, when entire ecosystems were being transformed. If there were coastal civilizations during the Ice Age, they would have faced an existential crisis as the ice melted and sea levels rose. Entire regions where millions of people might have lived would have been gradually submerged. The survivors would have been forced to migrate inland, potentially coming into conflict with existing populations or struggling to adapt to completely different environments. This scenario could explain both the genetic evidence of population mixing and the absence of archaeological evidence from coastal regions. The civilizations were there, but they're now under hundreds of feet of water and sediment. The genetic record also reveals something else that's crucial to understanding deep human history. The capacity for symbolic thinking, abstract reasoning, and complex social organization appears to be much older than we once believed. Studies of brain development and cognitive capacities suggest that anatomically modern humans 100,000 years ago had essentially the same mental capabilities we have today. They could think abstractly, plan for the future, create art and music, develop complex languages, and organize sophisticated social systems. If the hardware for civilization was already in place 100,000 years ago, why assume it took so long for the software to develop? Why assume that humans with our cognitive abilities would spend tens of thousands of years doing essentially the same things generation after generation without major innovations or social developments? The genetic evidence suggests they didn't. It suggests that human societies in the deep past were experimenting with complexity, organization, and achievement in ways that we're only beginning to understand. This brings us to one of the most compelling aspects of the genetic evidence. Unlike archaeological artifacts that can be disputed or reinterpreted, DNA doesn't lie. It carries an objective record of what actually happened in the past, even when that record contradicts our expectations or challenges our accepted timelines. When genetic evidence consistently points toward greater complexity, earlier innovation, and more sophisticated social organization than our archaeological models predict, we need to ask ourselves whether our models are incomplete. The answer that's emerging from multiple lines of genetic research is that they almost certainly are. Human history in the deep past was far more complex, dynamic, and interconnected than we've assumed. The simple story of gradual development from primitive to advanced doesn't match what we're learning about how our species actually evolved and spread across the planet. But genetics is just one piece of a larger puzzle. To really understand what might have been happening 100,000 years ago, we need to look at other types of evidence that complement and reinforce what the DNA is telling us. One of the most intriguing sources of information comes from human culture itself. Stories, myths, and oral traditions that have been passed down through generations, sometimes for thousands of years. These cultural memories might preserve traces of real historical events that happened so long ago that all physical evidence has been erased. Every culture on Earth has stories about great floods that destroyed earlier worlds. From the biblical account of Noah's flood to similar tales in Mesopotamian literature, from Native American traditions to Aboriginal Australian stories, the theme of catastrophic flooding that wipes out previous civilizations appears again and again across human cultures. Most scholars have traditionally interpreted these stories as either religious allegory or folk memories of local flooding events. But what if there's something more? What if they preserve actual historical memories of the massive sea level changes that occurred at the end of the last ice age? When the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose by more than 400 feet in some regions. Vast coastal plains that had been exposed for thousands of years were submerged. If there were civilizations living in these coastal areas, they would have faced exactly the kind of catastrophic flooding described in these ancient stories. The global distribution of flood myths is particularly striking. These stories appear in cultures that had no contact with each other, in regions separated by thousands of miles and completely different environments. Yet the basic elements of the stories are remarkably similar. A great civilization is destroyed by rising waters. A few survivors escape to higher ground or in boats. The world is essentially reset, and human society has to rebuild from scratch. If these stories really do preserve memories of actual historical events, they might be telling us something crucial about human civilization in the deep past. They might be telling us that the civilizations we know about aren't the first attempts at organized society. They might be the most recent attempts, the ones that happened after earlier civilizations were destroyed by natural disasters. This interpretation gains support when we look at other recurrent themes in world mythology. Stories of lost golden ages, of advanced civilizations that possessed knowledge and capabilities that were later forgotten. Tales of great cities that vanished beneath the waves or were buried by shifting sands. Plato's account of Atlantis is probably the most famous example, but it's far from the only one. Hindu traditions speak of Dwarka, a great city that was swallowed by the sea. Pacific island cultures have legends of entire land masses that disappeared beneath the waves. Aboriginal Australian stories describe landscapes that match features now underwater, which were last visible more than 10,000 years ago. The persistence and accuracy of some of these oral traditions is remarkable. In Australia, Aboriginal stories have been found to accurately describe geographic features that have been underwater for more than 10,000 years. If oral traditions can preserve such precise information for that long, what other historical memories might they contain? Some researchers have begun to take these stories more seriously as potential sources of historical information. They're not suggesting that we should read myths literally, but rather that we should consider the possibility that they contain kernels of actual historical memory that have been transformed and embellished over thousands of years of retelling. This approach has already yielded some interesting results. Geologists studying the Mediterranean have found evidence that supports certain aspects of flood myths from that region. Archaeologists investigating sites mentioned in oral traditions have sometimes found actual archaeological remains that correspond to the stories. If even a fraction of these cultural memories reflect real historical events, they paint a picture of human civilization that extends far deeper into the past than our conventional timeline suggests. They suggest cycles of development and destruction, of civilizations rising and falling across vast spans of time. But cultural evidence, like genetic evidence, is just one piece of a larger puzzle. To really understand what might have been happening 100,000 years ago, we need to look at the physical evidence as well, the artifacts, structures, and anomalies that don't quite fit our accepted chronology. And that's where things get really interesting, because scattered around the world are objects and sites that seem to exist outside the bounds of conventional archaeology. Artifacts that appear to be far older than they should be. Structures that show levels of sophistication that don't match their supposed age, and formations that some researchers argue show clear signs of human construction from periods when such construction should have been impossible. These anomalies are controversial, often disputed, and rarely accepted by mainstream archaeology. But they keep appearing, and their sheer number and global distribution suggest that something interesting might be happening that our current models can't account for. The question isn't whether any single anomaly proves the existence of ancient civilizations. The question is whether the pattern of anomalies, taken together with the genetic and cultural evidence, points toward a more complex history than we've been willing to consider. That's the investigation we're going to continue in the next part of this series. We're going to look at specific artifacts and sites that challenge our timeline. We're going to examine the underwater structures that might represent the remains of coastal civilizations. We're going to consider the possibility that some of the megalithic sites we know about might be far older than we think. And we're going to grapple with the fundamental question of how we distinguish between natural formations and human construction when we're dealing with evidence that's been weathered and eroded for tens of thousands of years. The journey into deep time is revealing layers of complexity that most of us never imagined. With each piece of evidence we examine, the picture becomes more intriguing and more mysterious. The simple story of human development that we learned in school is giving way to something far more complex and fascinating. Human civilization might not be a recent invention. It might be an ancient experiment that has been tried many times across our species' history, with varying degrees of success and failure. If that's true, then understanding our deep past isn't just about satisfying curiosity. It's about understanding the full range of human potential and learning from the successes and failures of civilizations that came before us. The evidence is scattered, fragmentary, and often ambiguous, but it's accumulating, and it's starting to paint a picture that challenges everything we thought we knew about who we are and where we came from. The real question is whether we're brave enough to follow that evidence wherever it leads, even if it takes us to conclusions that seem impossible from our current perspective. The artifacts that don't fit our timeline are scattered across every continent, waiting in museum storage rooms and private collections, often dismissed or explained away, because they challenge everything we think we know about when human civilization began. Picture this. You're an archaeologist working at a site that's supposed to be 50,000 years old. You're expecting to find crude stone tools, maybe some evidence of fire use, the basic signatures of early human survival. Instead, you uncover a blade that shows precision manufacturing, symmetrical design, and polishing techniques that shouldn't exist for another 40,000 years. What do you do with that discovery? Do you question your dating methods? Do you wonder if there's something fundamentally wrong with your understanding of human development? Or do you file it away as an anomaly and continue with the interpretation that fits your expectations? Unfortunately, the history of archaeology suggests that most unusual discoveries get filed away as anomalies. But what happens when the anomalies start piling up? What happens when researchers around the world keep finding artifacts that seem to exist outside the accepted timeline? That's exactly what's been happening for decades. Stone tools showing sophisticated manufacturing techniques from periods when humans were supposedly barely capable of basic tool making. Shell beads and ornamental objects from sites that predate the supposed invention of symbolic behavior. markings on stones and pieces of ochre that suggest abstract thinking tens of thousands of years before such thinking was thought possible. Each discovery by itself can be explained away. Dating errors, contamination, misinterpretation. But taken together, they form a pattern that's becoming harder and harder to ignore. They suggest that human technological and cultural development didn't follow the neat, linear progression that our textbooks describe. Consider what we've learned about symbolic behavior alone. For decades, the consensus was that humans didn't develop the capacity for abstract thinking and symbolic expression until around 40,000 years ago. This was supposed to represent a cognitive revolution, a fundamental shift in human consciousness that enabled art, music, complex language, and eventually civilization itself. But discoveries keep pushing that timeline further and further back. Engraved ochre from South Africa, dating to over 70,000 years ago. Shell beads from North Africa and the Middle East that are equally old. Cave paintings that might be twice as old as the famous examples from Europe. What's particularly striking about these discoveries is that they're not crude first attempts at symbolic expression. They show sophistication, standardization, and complexity that suggest these weren't new developments, but mature traditions with deep historical roots. If humans were creating sophisticated symbolic art 70,000 years ago, how long had they been developing the cultural and social structures necessary to support such activities? How far back do the real roots of human civilization extend? The dating methods themselves are part of the challenge. Radiocarbon dating, the most commonly used technique, only works reliably for materials up to about 50,000 years old. For older periods, archaeologists have to rely on other methods that are less precise and more open to interpretation. This creates a systematic bias in our understanding of deep prehistory. The further back we look, the less reliable our dating becomes, and the more likely we are to miss or misinterpret evidence of human achievement. It's entirely possible that sophisticated artifacts from 100,000 years ago are being consistently misdated to more recent periods because our methods aren't accurate enough to distinguish between them. But the challenges go beyond dating. There's also the question of recognition. Archaeologists are trained to identify certain types of artifacts and structures: pottery, metalwork, stone foundations, the material signatures of the civilizations we already know about. But what if ancient civilizations used different materials or organized themselves in ways we wouldn't recognize? What if they built primarily with organic materials that have since decayed? What if their technologies followed principles we haven't discovered or rediscovered yet? This isn't purely speculative. Even in the historical period, we know of advanced societies that left surprisingly little material evidence. The Indus Valley civilization had sophisticated urban planning, standardized weights and measures, and complex trade networks. But their writing system remains undeciphered, and much of their technology is still mysterious. If we can lose so much knowledge about a civilization that existed just 4,000 years ago, what might we have missed from periods 25 times more distant? The underwater evidence presents its own fascinating puzzle. As we explored earlier, vast areas of land that were exposed during the Ice Age are now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water. Any coastal civilizations from that period would be completely inaccessible to conventional archaeology. But occasionally, divers and underwater researchers report structures that seem too organized, too geometric to be natural formations. Step terraces that look like they might once have been buildings or ceremonial platforms. Stone blocks that appear to have been cut and fitted together. Alignments that suggest deliberate planning and construction. The most famous of these is probably the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan. Discovered in the 1980s, it features massive stone formations with flat surfaces, right angles, and what appear to be deliberate terraces and steps. Some researchers argue it's entirely natural, formed by geological processes over millions of years. Others insist the features are too precise and too organized to be anything but artificial. The debate continues, but Yonaguni isn't the only such site. Similar underwater formations have been reported off the coasts of India, in the Mediterranean, near the Bahamas, and in other locations around the world. In each case, the formations show features that some researchers interpret as evidence of human construction. The challenge with underwater archaeology is enormous. Working hundreds of feet below the surface, with limited visibility and equipment, it's incredibly difficult to distinguish between natural geology and ancient construction. Erosion, sediment deposition, and marine growth can obscure or mimic the signatures of human activity. But the sheer number of reports from different parts of the world suggests that something interesting might be happening beneath the waves. Even if most of these formations turn out to be natural, what if even one of them represents genuine evidence of construction from the deep past? The implications would extend far beyond archaeology. They would suggest that human civilization has experimented with complexity and organization far longer than we've assumed. They would mean that the societies we know about represent not the beginning of human achievement, but perhaps just the most recent chapter in a much longer story. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of megalithic construction around the world. These massive stone structures, built without mortar, appear on every continent and often show levels of precision and engineering sophistication that still puzzle modern experts. Most megaliths are dated to within the last 10,000 years, but their sophistication raises questions about whether the tradition might be much older. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, with its enormous carved pillars arranged in precise circles, are already pushing our timeline back to 12,000 years ago, well before the supposed invention of agriculture. But what if Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning of megalithic construction, but simply the oldest example that has survived? What if there were earlier experiments with monumental building that have been erased by time, erosion, and rising seas? The techniques used in megalithic construction are themselves mysterious. Many blocks are cut with flat, smooth surfaces and fitted together so precisely that you can't slide a knife blade between them. The methods for achieving this precision remain largely speculative, even when we're dealing with sites from known historical periods. Moving and positioning blocks that weigh hundreds of tons would challenge modern engineering. The logistics alone require sophisticated planning, coordination, and social organization. If people 12,000 years ago could organize such massive construction projects, what might their predecessors have been capable of? The global distribution of megalithic sites is also intriguing. Similar construction techniques appear in regions separated by thousands of miles, among cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. This could represent independent invention, but it could also suggest connections and knowledge sharing that our historical models don't account for. Some researchers have proposed that megalithic construction represents a global tradition with much deeper roots than we recognize. They argue that the sites we know about might be the most recent examples of building techniques that were developed and refined over tens of thousands of years. If this interpretation is correct, then the sudden appearance of sophisticated megalithic construction in the archaeological record might not represent a sudden invention, but the rediscovery or continuation of much older traditions. This pattern of apparent sudden appearance, followed by rapid development, shows up repeatedly in human history. Writing systems, metallurgy, agricultural techniques, and astronomical knowledge all seem to appear in the archaeological record with surprising sophistication, as if they emerged fully formed rather than developing gradually over time. The traditional explanation is that we're simply missing the developmental phases, that the gradual progression existed but didn't leave clear archaeological signatures. But what if there's another explanation? What if some of these innovations represent the rediscovery of knowledge that existed in earlier periods but was lost during catastrophic events or cultural collapses? This possibility becomes more plausible when we consider the environmental challenges that human societies would have faced during the transition from the Ice Age to the modern climate. Massive changes in sea level, shifting weather patterns, the disappearance of entire ecosystems, and the extinction of many large animal species would have created enormous stress for any existing civilizations. Societies that had developed along Ice Age coastlines would have faced existential crises as sea levels rose. Agricultural systems adapted to cooler climates would have had to be completely restructured. Trade networks spanning continents might have been disrupted by changing geography and climate. Under these circumstances, it's entirely plausible that sophisticated civilizations could have collapsed, leaving only scattered survivors who preserved fragments of knowledge and gradually rebuilt simpler societies. The innovations we see emerging in the archaeological record might represent not new inventions, but the slow recovery and rediscovery of older knowledge. This scenario would explain both the apparent gaps in our archaeological record and the sophisticated nature of early developments in known civilizations. It would suggest that human society has experimented with complexity multiple times across our species' history with varying degrees of success and failure. The genetic evidence we discussed earlier supports this interpretation. The complex patterns of population mixing, separation, and reconnection revealed by DNA analysis suggest dynamic societies with long-distance connections and sophisticated social organization extending far back into prehistory. Cultural evidence from myths and oral traditions also fits this pattern. Stories of lost golden ages, advanced civilizations that possessed forgotten knowledge, and catastrophic events that forced humanity to start over appear in cultures around the world. When we combine the genetic evidence, the cultural memories, and the archaeological anomalies, a picture begins to emerge that's far more complex than our traditional timeline suggests. Human civilization might not be a recent development that began with agriculture 10,000 years ago. It might be an ancient experiment that has been tried many times, with each attempt building on the successes and learning from the failures of previous cycles. This interpretation doesn't require us to imagine civilizations with technology superior to our own. It simply requires us to recognize that human intelligence and creativity are not recent developments, and that people with our cognitive abilities might have achieved remarkable things even when working with the materials and energy sources available in the deep past. The evidence is fragmentary, ambiguous, and often controversial. But it's accumulating, and it's starting to point toward conclusions that would fundamentally change our understanding of human history and human potential. If we're right about this, if there really were complex civilizations in the deep past, then the story of humanity is far older and more remarkable than we've imagined. It suggests that we're not the first generation to grapple with questions of sustainability, social organization, and technological development. It means that somewhere in our forgotten past, there might be lessons about how to build societies that can thrive over long periods, and perhaps warnings about the consequences of failing to do so. The search for evidence of ancient civilizations isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about understanding the full scope of human achievement and learning from the experiences of those who came before us. Even if their cities are now underwater, their monuments eroded to dust, and their technologies forgotten. The knowledge they gained through centuries of experimentation and development might still have value for the challenges we face today. As we continue this investigation, we're going to look more closely at the specific evidence that supports these possibilities. We're going to examine the underwater sites that might preserve traces of coastal civilizations. We're going to consider the maps and documents that some researchers believe contain knowledge from much older sources. And we're going to explore what it would mean for our understanding of human nature and human potential if we discovered that civilization really is much older than we think. The journey into deep time is revealing layers of mystery and complexity that challenge our most basic assumptions about who we are and where we came from. The evidence may be scattered and fragmentary, but it's pointing toward a story of human achievement that extends far deeper into the past than we ever imagined possible. But here's where the investigation takes a truly mind-bending turn. What if the evidence we've been examining, these scattered artifacts and underwater anomalies and genetic mysteries, represent something even more extraordinary than we've considered? What if we're not just looking at the remains of lost civilizations, but at evidence of human societies that achieved things we can barely comprehend today? This might sound like science fiction, but bear with me. We've established that humans 100,000 years ago had the same cognitive capabilities we possess now. Same brain structure, same capacity for abstract thought, same ability to innovate and organize. They had the same fundamental intelligence, the same creativity, the same drive to understand and manipulate their environment. Now, here's the crucial question. If these people had 100,000 years to experiment, to develop, to refine their understanding of the natural world, what might they have discovered that we haven't? Think about it this way. Our modern scientific revolution has given us incredible technologies in just a few centuries. We've gone from horse-drawn carriages to spaceflight in less than 200 years. We've developed computers, split the atom, decoded DNA, and begun to understand the fundamental structure of reality itself. But we've only been doing serious scientific investigation for a tiny fraction of human history. What could the civilization accomplish with 1,000 times longer to work with? This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable for mainstream science, because we're entering territory that challenges not just our timeline of human development, but our assumptions about the nature of technological progress itself. We tend to think of technology as following a predictable path. Stone tools, bronze, iron, steel, electronics, computers, each stage building on the previous one in a logical sequence that leads inevitably to our current level of development. But what if that's not the only path? What if there are completely different approaches to understanding and manipulating the natural world that we haven't discovered yet? What if ancient civilizations developed along technological trajectories that we wouldn't even recognize as technology? Consider energy, for instance. Our entire technological civilization is built on the manipulation of fossil fuels, electricity, and nuclear power. But what if there are other forms of energy that we haven't learned to harness yet? What if ancient peoples discovered ways to work with natural forces that we've forgotten or never learned? This isn't pure speculation. Even today, we're discovering phenomena that challenge our understanding of physics and energy. Quantum effects that seem to violate our classical understanding of reality. Biological systems that operate with efficiencies that exceed our best engineering. Natural processes that accomplish things our technology can't replicate. If modern science, with all our instruments and mathematical models, is still discovering fundamental aspects of how the universe works, what might ancient peoples have learned through different approaches to investigation and experimentation? The archaeological record gives us tantalizing hints that such knowledge might have existed. Precision in stone cutting that we can't fully explain. Construction techniques that move massive blocks with methods we can only guess at. Astronomical alignments that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. But perhaps most intriguingly, we find evidence of what some researchers call impossible artifacts. Objects that appear to have been manufactured using processes we don't understand, or that demonstrate knowledge of principles we've only recently discovered. These artifacts are controversial precisely because they don't fit our technological timeline. A metallic sphere with intricate internal structure found in rock formations supposedly millions of years old. Tools that show evidence of precision manufacturing from periods when such precision should have been impossible. Crystals that have been shaped and polished using techniques we can't identify. Most of these discoveries are dismissed by mainstream science as hoaxes, misinterpretations, or contamination from more recent periods. And in many cases, that dismissal is probably justified. The history of archaeology is full of mistakes and fraudulent claims. But what's interesting is the pattern of dismissal itself. When artifacts don't fit our expected timeline, we tend to assume there must be something wrong with the artifact, rather than something incomplete about our timeline. This creates a kind of circular reasoning. We reject evidence that doesn't fit our models and then use the absence of such evidence to justify our models. It's a system that's very good at maintaining consistency, but not necessarily very good at recognizing when fundamental assumptions might be wrong. The underwater evidence becomes even more compelling when viewed from this perspective. If advanced civilizations did exist during the Ice Age, they would have had access to resources and environments that no longer exist. Vast continental shelves that are now submerged were once dry land with completely different ecosystems. Rivers that no longer exist carved valleys through landscapes that are now ocean floor. Mountain ranges that are now islands once connected entire continents. In this lost world, civilizations could have developed in ways that would be impossible today. They could have built cities in locations that are now hundreds of feet underwater. They could have developed technologies adapted to climatic conditions that no longer exist. They could have created networks of trade and communication across land masses that are now separated by thousands of miles of ocean. When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, these civilizations would have faced catastrophic disruption. Not just individual cities or regions, but entire continents' worth of development could have been submerged in a relatively short period of geological time. The survivors would have been forced to retreat to higher ground, often in regions with completely different resources and environmental conditions. Knowledge systems that had been developed over thousands of years for Ice Age conditions might have become useless overnight. Under these circumstances, even highly advanced civilizations could have collapsed completely, leaving only scattered survivors who preserved fragments of knowledge in oral traditions and myths. This scenario would explain several puzzling aspects of known history. Why did the earliest civilizations we know about seem to appear suddenly with sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and engineering? Why do similar technologies and cultural practices appear simultaneously in regions separated by thousands of miles? Why do so many cultures have myths about lost golden ages and forgotten knowledge? If these early civilizations weren't starting from scratch, but were instead rebuilding from the fragments of much older traditions, their rapid development makes more sense. The genetic evidence supports this interpretation in fascinating ways. Those ghost lineages we discussed, the DNA signatures of human populations that have never been found in the archaeological record, might represent entire civilizations that were completely erased by environmental catastrophes. Some geneticists have identified population bottlenecks in human history that correspond to major environmental changes. These bottlenecks suggest that human populations crashed dramatically at certain points, then recovered and expanded again. If these crashes represent the collapse of advanced civilizations rather than simple population fluctuations among hunter-gatherer groups, they paint a picture of human history that's far more dramatic and complex than our current models suggest. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this investigation involves consciousness itself. We've been assuming that human cognitive capacity has remained essentially unchanged for the past 100,000 years. But what if that assumption is wrong? Modern neuroscience is revealing that human consciousness is far more plastic and adaptable than we once believed. Our brains can be shaped by our experiences, our practices, and our cultural environments in ways that fundamentally alter how we perceive and interact with reality. What if ancient peoples developed practices and techniques for enhancing human consciousness that we've forgotten? What if they discovered ways of accessing information and understanding that don't depend on external technology, but on the development of human potential itself? This might sound mystical, but it's actually grounded in solid neuroscience. We know that meditation practices can literally change brain structure. We know that certain training regimens can enhance memory, perception, and cognitive processing in remarkable ways. We know that human consciousness can access information and solve problems through processes we don't fully understand. If ancient civilizations had thousands of years to develop such practices, to refine techniques for enhancing human cognitive capacity, they might have achieved levels of understanding and capability that would seem impossible to us today. This could explain some of the more mysterious aspects of ancient achievements. How did they calculate astronomical cycles with such precision without modern instruments? How did they move massive stone blocks without modern machinery? How did they develop mathematical and engineering knowledge that we're only now rediscovering? The answer might not be that they had better technology in the sense we usually mean. The answer might be that they had better developed human capabilities. They might have trained their minds and bodies to accomplish things that we've forgotten how to do. This interpretation becomes even more compelling when we consider the role of consciousness in quantum physics. Modern science is discovering that observation and consciousness seem to play fundamental roles in the behavior of matter and energy at the quantum level. If consciousness really does interact with physical reality in ways we're only beginning to understand, then civilizations that developed advanced practices for training and enhancing consciousness might have been able to accomplish things that seem impossible from our current scientific perspective. This doesn't mean they violated the laws of physics. It means they might have understood and worked with aspects of physics that we haven't discovered yet. The implications of this possibility are staggering. It would mean that human potential is far greater than we've assumed. It would suggest that the limitations we take for granted might not be limitations at all, but simply gaps in our knowledge and development. If ancient civilizations really did achieve such capabilities, their collapse would represent not just the loss of cities and technologies, but the loss of entire approaches to understanding and working with reality itself. The knowledge systems that took thousands of years to develop would have been lost in a few generations of catastrophic change. The practices and techniques that enhanced human consciousness would have been forgotten as survivors struggled simply to stay alive in a dramatically changed world. But perhaps not everything was lost. Perhaps fragments of this knowledge survived in mystery schools, esoteric traditions, and spiritual practices that have been preserved across thousands of years. Perhaps some of the techniques for enhancing human consciousness are still available to us if we know where to look for them. This brings us to one of the most profound questions raised by this entire investigation. If advanced civilizations really did exist in the deep past, what happened to them? Why did they disappear? And what can their fate teach us about our own civilization? The evidence suggests that the collapse of Ice Age civilizations was primarily environmental. Massive climate change, rising sea levels, and ecosystem disruption created challenges that even advanced societies couldn't overcome. But there might be other factors as well. Social instability, resource depletion, conflicts between different groups, or simply the difficulty of maintaining complex systems across long periods of time. If we're right about this, if human civilization has risen and fallen multiple times across our species' history, then we're not the first generation to face questions about sustainability, social organization, and long-term survival. Somewhere in our forgotten past, there might be civilizations that learned how to build sustainable societies that lasted for thousands of years. There might be examples of social systems that successfully balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility. There might be technologies that worked with natural systems rather than against them. So here we stand at the edge of one of the greatest mysteries in human history. We've journeyed through genetic evidence that reveals lost populations, examined artifacts that challenge our timelines, and considered the possibility that entire civilizations lie buried beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water and sediment. The question isn't whether we can prove that advanced civilizations existed 100,000 years ago, but whether we're brave enough to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it challenges everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our past. Human civilization might be far older, far more complex,